Rain pounded relentlessly against the windows of the Harper mansion as furious knocks echoed through the front door. "Open up, court order," before anyone inside could respond. The doors swung open. Creditors, deputies, and bank officials flooded into the once proud estate. One by one, furniture was carried away. Paintings disappeared from the walls. Cabinets were sealed. The family piano was rolled out into the pouring rain, while servants quietly gathered their own belongings and slipped away without a word. Outside, the last horse in the Harper stable fought against the rope around its neck, neighing desperately as it was led through the front gate. For years, the Harper family had been the wealthiest household for miles. Now, even their final horse no longer belonged to them. Standing in the middle of the empty entrance hall, Margaret Harper stared helplessly as another official nailed a seizure notice onto the front gate. Within a single morning, the Harper family had lost everything. For several long seconds, Margaret Harper simply stood there, staring at the empty doorway where the last wagon had disappeared into the rain. Her lips trembled. Her hands shook. She looked as though she might collapse, but instead of breaking down, she turned toward the kitchen. There, a young woman quietly knelt on the floor, picking up the shattered pieces of a crystal vase that had fallen during the chaos. She never looked up. She simply continued cleaning, as if hoping silence could make her invisible. Margaret stormed across the room and, without a single warning, slapped her hard across the face. The crack silenced the entire house. The young woman stumbled, but never fought back. Margaret pointed at her with trembling fingers, her voice shaking with bitterness. "Ever since your father dragged you into this house, nothing has gone right. You brought nothing but bad luck. My husband died, our business collapsed, and now we've lost everything. You ruined this family." The young woman lowered her head. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even wipe away the blood where a shard of crystal had cut her hand. Across the room, Elizabeth watched the scene with the faintest smile curling at the corner of her lips. Not because her family had lost everything, but because, for once, someone else was suffering more than she was. At that exact moment, the sound of wagon wheels stopped outside the front gate. Everyone turned toward the sound. A battered wagon rolled into the muddy driveway, pulled by a thin bay horse whose ribs were plainly visible beneath its wet coat. Dust still clung to the wagon, despite the rain, as though it had traveled for days without rest. The driver climbed down without hurry. I was a tall young man, with long dark hair, tied loosely behind his neck. His weathered buckskin coat had been patched more than once, and his worn leather boots were stained with mud from countless miles on the trail. There was nothing about him that suggested wealth. Margaret frowned. Elizabeth let out a quiet scoff. Another poor traveler. What could he possibly want here? The young man calmly reached inside his coat and unfolded an old piece of yellowed paper. The edges were worn, and the ink had faded with age, but two signatures remained clearly visible at the bottom. William Gray, Jonathan Harper. Without another word, he walked toward the front door. The young man stopped in the middle of the entrance hall, ignoring the deputies, the creditors, and the curious stares fixed upon him. He looked down at the old document once, then lifted his eyes to Margaret Harper. "I've come." He paused just long enough for every person in the room to wonder what was written on that worn piece of paper. To fulfill an engagement promise. The room fell silent. No one understood what he meant. Margaret Harper snatched the yellowed document from the young man's hand. The paper was old, but every word remained clear. It was a formal agreement, signed years ago by Jonathan Harper and William Gray. Her eyes raced down the page, the son of William Gray, shall marry Elizabeth Harper, the eldest daughter of Jonathan Harper. She swallowed. Then came the final paragraph. Upon the marriage, every debt owed by the Harper family shall become the responsibility of the Gray family and be paid in full. The room fell deathly silent. Even the deputies exchanged puzzled glances. She lifted her eyes toward the stranger, standing calmly in the middle of her ruined mansion. For the first time since he arrived, she truly looked at him. Elizabeth stepped forward before her mother could say a word. She looked the young man up and down without the slightest attempt to hide her contempt. His patched buckskin coat, his faded trousers, his mud-stained boots, and the battered wagon waiting outside behind a horse so thin its ribs showed through its wet coat. Then she laughed. At first it was only a quiet chuckle. Within seconds, she was laughing so hard she had to cover her mouth. "You," she said between laughs, "you're the one who's supposed to save this family." She shook her head in disbelief before pointing toward his worn boots. "I'm not even sure you have enough money to buy yourself a decent pair of boots, let alone pay off debts this large." A few deputies exchanged awkward glances. Even the remaining servants lowered their eyes, embarrassed by her cruelty. The young man never answered. He simply stood there, calm and silent, as though her words meant nothing at all. Elizabeth mistook his silence for shame. She smiled even more proudly. What she didn't know was that the poorest-looking man in the room was the only one who could save them all. The laughter slowly faded, but the young man never reacted. He simply folded the old agreement, slipped it back inside his coat, and looked at Elizabeth with the same calm expression. "If you refuse the marriage," he said quietly, "I'll leave." No pleading, no bargaining, no attempt to persuade her. He gave a polite nod, turned toward the front door, and took his first step away. For a moment, everyone in the room simply watched him leave. It was as if paying the Harper family's debts meant far less to him than keeping his own dignity. "Wait." Margaret's voice cut through the silence before he reached the door. Her desperate eyes swept across the nearly empty entrance hall until they stopped on a young woman, quietly kneeling beside a bucket, wiping broken glass from the kitchen floor, as though none of this had anything to do with her. An idea flashed across Margaret's face. She hurriedly picked up the agreement and read one sentence again. "The son of William Gray shall marry a daughter of the Harper family." She read it a second time. There was no mention of the eldest daughter, a daughter of the Harper family. A slow smile spread across her face. "Then she'll do." Before anyone could react, Margaret strode across the room, grabbed the frightened young woman by the wrist, and pulled her into the entrance hall. "This girl is a Harper too," she declared coldly. "She'll take her sister's place." Without asking a single question, Margaret seized the young woman's trembling hand and placed it into the stranger's. The room held its breath. The young man lowered his eyes to the frightened young woman. She couldn't even bring herself to look at him. Several long seconds passed. Then he quietly said, "Very well." No one spoke, least of all the young woman who had just become someone else's bride. As the young man accepted her hand, the frightened girl finally looked up. For the first time, their eyes met. She couldn't understand why a complete stranger had agreed to marry her without asking a single question. Her name was Clara Harper. She had just turned 19. And in that moment, memories she had spent years trying to bury came rushing back. She remembered standing beside a lonely grave, her small hand clutched tightly in her father's. The wind had carried away the last prayers for her mother as he gently led her away from the cemetery and toward the Harper mansion. From that day on, she never truly had a home again. The Grand Harper house became a place where she was expected to work, not belong. while Margaret managed the household. Clara scrubbed floors, washed clothes, carried water, and cleaned the kitchen from sunrise until long after dark. Her father spent most of his time traveling to build the family business, believing his daughters were being raised under the same roof, with the same love. He never saw what happened after he rode away. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by expensive dresses, music lessons, and endless praise. The more beautiful Clara body, the colder Elizabeth's heart turned if someone complimented Clara's smile. Elizabeth demanded a finer dress. If a young man glanced at Clara in town, Elizabeth made certain he never looked twice. She couldn't bear the thought of her younger sister receiving anything she believed belonged to her. Then tragedy struck. During one of his business journeys, Jonathan Harper was killed in an accident. Everything he had built passed into Margaret's hands. She knew how to spend money. She did not know how to protect it. Within a few short years, the fortune disappeared. The businesses failed. Loans piled upon loans until the Harper family was left with nothing but debt, and the mansion that was now only days away from being seized. Through it all, Clara remained exactly where she had always been, quietly working and quietly enduring. Margaret wasted no time. "If you're going to marry," she said coldly, "then you'll do it today." The young man gave a single nod. Very well. There were no flowers waiting outside the church, no white dress, no wedding guests, no music to mark the beginning of a new life. The entire ceremony consisted of a short ride into town, a quiet office, an aging minister, and a weary clerk who had witnessed more hurried marriages than happy ones. The papers were placed before them. Clara hesitated for only a heartbeat before signing her name. The young man followed with a steady hand. The clerk pressed the official seal onto the document. Just like that, they were husband and wife before they left. The clerk handed over 2 simple wedding bands. The young man accepted them, then reached gently for Clara's hand. His gaze lingered for a few quiet seconds on her hands. The skin was rough. Tiny cracks marked her knuckles, the silent scars of years spent carrying water, scrubbing floors, and doing work no young woman should have endured. His hand paused. For several quiet seconds, he simply looked at her. Then, with unexpected care, he slid the ring onto her finger so gently that it was almost impossible to notice. No one knew where the money had come from. Not Margaret. Not Elizabeth. Not even Clara. The following morning, the doors of the town bank had barely opened when a young clerk came rushing into the manager's office, clutching a stack of freshly stamped documents. "The Harper account," he gasped. "It's been paid. Every cent." The manager stared at the papers in disbelief before reading the figures again. There was no mistake. Every outstanding loan, every overdue payment, every last dollar the Harper family owed had disappeared overnight. Word spread through town faster than the morning wind. Margaret stood frozen. Elizabeth snatched the receipt from the banker's hands, reading it again and again, as if the numbers might suddenly change. "This is impossible," she shouted. "That poor nobody couldn't have that kind of money." Around them, whispers swept across the crowded bank. If the young stranger truly possessed a fortune large enough to erase the Harper family's debts in a single night, then who, exactly, had Clara Harper just married? When the last of the paperwork was finished, neither of them lingered outside the town office. The young man said nothing. Instead, he walked to the wagon, lifted Clara's old wooden trunk with both hands, and placed it carefully inside, before fastening it securely with a length of rope. He never asked her to carry it. Clara opened her mouth to thank him. Before the words could leave her lips, he had already turned away to gather the reins. The wagon rolled quietly out of town. Neither of them spoke. The farther they traveled, the fewer houses remained behind. Dirt roads replaced stone streets, and the sounds of the town slowly faded beneath the steady rhythm of iron-rimmed wheels rolling across the earth. Clara turned for one last look, not because she would miss the place, but as if she needed to convince herself that she had truly left it behind. The young man noticed. He simply kept driving. The wagon creaked along the mountain road. Its steady rhythm stirred a memory Clara had never forgotten. Years earlier, on another quiet afternoon, she had ridden in a wagon beside her father. She had been so small that her feet couldn't reach the floorboards. Jonathan Harper had lifted her onto the seat beside him, smiling as though he believed he was giving her a brighter future. "From today on," he had said warmly, "this will be your home." The little girl had smiled back, without a trace of doubt. The memory ended there. Only the sound of wagon wheels remained. Clara blinked, and the mountain road returned. Without realizing it, her fingers tightened around the edge of her faded skirt. A cool breeze drifted down from the hills. The young man glanced at her once, reached behind the seat, and quietly unfolded a thin wool blanket. Without a word, he draped it gently across her knees before turning his eyes back to the road. Clara lowered her gaze to the blanket, then stole a brief glance at the man beside her. She said nothing. Neither did he. But for the first time in many years, the silence no longer felt cold. By the time the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the wagon finally came to a stop. Clara looked up. Before them stood a small wooden cabin, tucked among towering pines. Its weathered walls bore the marks of many winters. The roof was plain, the porch narrow, and the place looked far humbler than the grand homes scattered across town. She quietly looked around. There was no disappointment in her eyes, compared to the cold kitchen where she had spent countless nights sleeping beside the stove. This little cabin already felt like a luxury. The young man climbed down first and unloaded her old trunk without a word. He carried it to the front door, pushed it open, and stepped aside so she could enter. Warm air drifted toward her. A fire was already burning inside the stone fireplace. Someone had chopped fresh firewood and neatly stacked it beside the hearth. A kettle rested above the glowing embers. As though everything had been prepared long before they arrived, the young man set the trunk gently on the floor. "For now," he said quietly, "we'll stay here." Nothing more. Clara simply nodded. To her, the little cabin was more than enough. To everyone else, it would have looked exactly like the home of a poor man with nothing left to his name. That evening, their first meal together was as simple as the cabin itself. A pot of vegetable stew simmered over the fire. Fresh bread rested between them, on the wooden table. Neither of them spoke much. Only the quiet crackle of burning logs filled the room. When the meal was over, the young man reached into his coat and unfolded a single sheet of paper. He placed it gently in front of Clara. "I'd like you to read this." She lowered her eyes. It was a written agreement. 1 year. They would remain husband and wife for 1 year. When that year came to an end, if she wished to leave, he would sign the divorce papers without objection. Anything legally placed in her name during the marriage would remain hers. He would never ask her to return a single dollar or a single possession. Clara read every line in silence. Then she slowly lifted her eyes to him. He waited without urging her. After a long moment, she picked up the pen and signed her name. A faint sadness settled quietly in her heart. Not because the marriage might end, but because she couldn't help thinking that even this kind, gentle man had no desire to keep her by his side. Across the table, the young man carefully folded the agreement and tucked it safely away. His thoughts drifted in the opposite direction. At least after 1 year, she'll finally be free to choose the life she truly wants. The fire continued to burn between them. Each believed they were thinking of the other's happiness. Neither realized how completely they had misunderstood one another. Night settled quietly over the little cabin. The mountains faded into darkness as the last glow of sunset disappeared beyond the trees. Unable to sleep, the young man stepped onto the porch. A chestnut horse lifted its head from the grass and walked toward him with an easy familiarity. He smiled faintly. Without a word, he reached out and slowly brushed his hand along the horse's mane. The simple gesture stirred a memory he had carried for years. A younger boy stood at the edge of a pasture, far enough away that no one noticed him. Not far ahead, a young girl knelt beside an injured horse. A length of barbed wire had become tangled around one of its legs. The frightened animal jerked violently. Mud splashed across the girl's dress. She never stepped back. Instead, she laughed softly as she tried once more to free the frightened animal. Watching from a distance, the boy found himself smiling too. The memory ended as quietly as it had appeared. The night returned. His hand was still resting gently against the horse's neck. He gave the animal one last reassuring pat before turning toward the cabin. Nothing on his face revealed that anything had crossed his mind. But somewhere in the silence, it almost felt as though he had seen Clara long before the day she became his wife. The first light of dawn slipped quietly through the cabin window. Clara woke before the sun had fully risen. For years, she had trained herself to rise before everyone else. If she was late, breakfast would not be ready. The floors would remain unswept. The water would stay cold. Old habits did not disappear overnight. She quietly dressed and stepped into the kitchen. Then she stopped. A kettle was already humming gently over the fire. Fresh hot water waited beside the stove. Outside the back door, a neat stack of split firewood rested against the wall. She frowned slightly. Stepping onto the porch, she found the horse already fed. The stable had been cleaned until the floor was covered with fresh straw. A steady tapping sound echoed nearby. The young man stood beside the front door, patiently adjusting a crooked wooden hinge. A hammer rested comfortably in his hand, as though repairing broken things was simply another part of the morning. Clara watched him for a long moment before speaking. "When did you wake up?" He didn't look up. He tightened one last nail before answering in the same calm voice. "I'm used to it." Nothing more. No complaint, no pride, no hint that he expected gratitude. To him, these quiet chores were as ordinary as the sunrise itself. Clara lowered her eyes. For the first time in many years, she realized someone had risen before her, simply so she wouldn't have to. The days passed quietly. One morning, Clara reached for the water bucket. The broken handle had already been stitched with fresh leather. Another day, she picked up the broom. Someone had replaced the worn wooden handle overnight. Not long after, a small shelf appeared beneath the higher one in the kitchen. She no longer had to stand on tiptoe. A chair was moved beside the window, exactly where the afternoon sunlight lingered the longest, exactly where she always paused to read for a few precious minutes after finishing her chores. The young man never mentioned any of it, as though those things had simply happened on their own. Clara began noticing them one by one. None of them were grand gestures. None of them cost much. But for the first time in her life, someone was quietly making the world around her a little easier. And somehow, that touched her more deeply than words ever could. That night, the young man stood alone on the porch. For a long moment, he reached into the side pocket of his coat. Between the pages of a worn leather notebook lay a single dried wildflower. Its petals had long since faded, Yet it had been carefully pressed, untouched by time. He looked at it quietly, then slipped it back into his pocket. Years ago, a young girl sat beside a clear mountain stream. A book rested in her lap. The breeze stirred her hair. A tiny wildflower slipped free and drifted onto the grass. She never noticed. A hand reached down, picked it up, held it for a quiet moment. The memory faded. The night returned. The young man stood exactly where he had been, his expression unchanged. Inside the cabin, Clara had already fallen asleep. She had no idea that somewhere in the past, someone had quietly kept a flower she never even knew she had lost. That evening, after the young man had fallen asleep, Clara noticed the tear along the sleeve of his work shirt. She carried it to the window, under the soft glow of an oil lamp. She carefully stitched the fabric back together, one small stitch at a time. Before dawn, she folded it neatly and placed it where he would find it. The next morning, he came to breakfast wearing that very shirt. He said nothing. He didn't ask who had mended it. He didn't thank her. He simply wore it, as if it had always belonged that way. Clara looked up from her bowl. A quiet smile touched her lips before she could hide it. No words were spoken, yet the silence between them no longer felt unfamiliar. For the first time, it felt warm. The morning sky had been clear when the young man climbed into the hills to check his trap line. By afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the mountains. Rain fell without warning. The trails turned slick beneath his boots. One careless step, he slipped down the rocky slope. His shoulders struck hard against a fallen log. By nightfall, Clara could no longer sit still. She grabbed a lantern and stepped into the storm. The wind nearly tore the light from her hand. She called his name only once. No answer. Then, she found him leaning against a tree, soaked to the bone, his injured shoulder barely able to move. Without a word, she slipped his arm over her shoulders. Relief struck her so suddenly that her knees almost gave way. Without a word, she slipped beneath his arm. Together, they made the long walk home, one slow step after another. She stayed awake through the night, changing the bandage, cooling the fever, adding another log to the fire whenever it burned low. The young man kept his eyes closed, pretending to sleep. As Clara leaned closer to replace the dressing, his eyes quietly opened. The lantern light rested softly on her tired face. A loose strand of hair clung to her cheek. He watched her quietly, as though afraid even a whisper might disturb the moment. Hours later, exhaustion finally overcame her. Still sitting beside the bed, Clara drifted to sleep. Her head rested against the wooden frame. Very carefully, the young man pulled the blanket over her shoulders. His hand paused for only a heartbeat before slipping away into the darkness. As Clara wrapped the fresh bandage around his shoulder, the dull ache carried him back to another day, another wound. He still remembered the moment he had made the decision. People would call it foolish. Some had even called him insane, to trade away everything he had spent years building, just to pay a debt that did not belong to him. Looking back, he could no longer remember how many nights he had wrestled with that choice. He only remembered the answer. If he had to choose again, he would still sign his name. He had never regretted it, not once. The memory unfolded before him. His ranch house stood behind him, quiet beneath the morning sun. In front of him, buyers moved from one property to the next, checking documents and counting payments. The pasture, sold. The western grazing land, sold. The timber rights, sold. The herd of cattle that had taken years to build, sold. The horses he had raised since they were foals, sold. Every signature erased another piece of the life he had built with his own hands. Yet each time the papers were placed before him, he signed without asking for another dollar, without bargaining, without hesitation. When the last document was folded away, the broker gathered the contracts and looked at him for a long moment. "I've handled sales for nearly 30 years," the older man said quietly. "I've never seen anyone walk away from this much." He accepted the ring of keys with both hands. "Thank you, Ethan." The name lingered in the silence. The young man simply nodded. Then he turned and walked away, with nothing left to his name, except the promise we had already decided to keep. The days after the storm settled back into their quiet rhythm. The young man's shoulder healed a little more with each sunrise, though Clara still insisted on changing the bandage every evening. He never argued anymore. If she told him to sit still, he simply did. One crisp morning, they were repairing the old fence along the pasture. The wind carried the scent of fresh-cut pine, and the valley was wrapped in the gentle stillness that came after several days of rain. Clara stood a few steps away, gathering loose boards while he drove another nail into the weathered post. Without thinking, she looked up and called, "Ethan!" The hammer stopped. Only for the briefest moment. Ethan didn't turn around immediately. His hand remained resting on the handle, as though he wasn't quite certain he had heard correctly. For years, his name had been spoken by strangers, business partners, ranch hands, and neighbors. But hearing it from her was something entirely different. He slowly looked over his shoulder. "Yes." Clara blinked, almost surprised by her own choice of words. Could you hand me that saw?" For a heartbeat. Neither of them said anything. Then Ethan walked over, placed the saw gently into her hands, and returned to his work as though nothing unusual had happened. No smile crossed his face. But for the rest of the day, every swing of his hammer felt lighter. The ache in his injured shoulder no longer seemed worth noticing. More than once, he caught himself remembering the way she had said his name. Not Mr. Gray. Not with distance, simply, Ethan. He never mentioned it, and she never realized that a single word had become the happiest moment of his day. The morning after Ethan's bandage was finally removed, Clara woke before dawn. The cabin was still wrapped in silence as she quietly lit the stove. She mixed flour into biscuit dough, fried a few strips of bacon, and brewed fresh coffee, filling the little room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When Ethan stepped into the kitchen, he stopped for a moment. Breakfast was already waiting on the table. Clara glanced up only briefly. "I thought you shouldn't start working on an empty stomach." Just a simple sentence, spoken as naturally as if she had always done it. Ethan nodded and took his seat. He never asked why she had gotten up so early. He simply picked up his fork and quietly finished every bite on his plate. Clara smiled to herself, pleased that he had a good appetite after his injury. She never realized that this was the first breakfast anyone had ever prepared for him. When he finished, he looked at her for a brief moment. "Thank you, Clara." His voice was as calm as ever. Yet for the rest of that morning, every chore seemed a little lighter. The little cabin hadn't changed, but somehow, it no longer felt empty. The old fence had survived too many winters. Several boards had already begun to rot, and every repair seemed to uncover another problem waiting beneath. Clara held one end of a long wooden plank, while Ethan secured the other. "Just a little higher," he said. She nodded and lifted. The weathered post suddenly gave way. The plank slipped free. Before either of them could react, they lost their balance and tumbled backward into a pile of freshly cut hay. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Ethan pushed himself up first, looking almost embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said, brushing the straw from his shirt. "I should have seen that coming." Clara looked at the hay tangled in his hair, then at the puzzled expression on his face. A soft laugh escaped her lips before she could stop herself. It grew into bright, genuine laughter that echoed across the quiet pasture. It was warm, carefree, the kind of laughter that came from someone who had forgotten, if only for a moment, how heavy life could be. Ethan didn't say a word. He simply watched her. The corners of his mouth slowly lifted into a smile of his own. Small, quiet, but completely real. For the first time since they had met, they weren't just husband and wife bound by circumstance. They were simply two people, sharing a moment neither of them wanted to end. 3 days later, another storm swept across the mountains. The rain fell harder than before. By morning, part of the hillside behind the cabin had collapsed, sending rocks and mud crashing down only a few yards from the back wall. The little cabin was still standing, but it was no longer safe. Clara looked at the damaged hillside in silence. So, what do we do now? Ethan didn't answer right away. He stood in the rain, staring at the cabin for a long moment. That small house had sheltered him for years. Every chair, every shelf, every repaired floorboard carried traces of the quiet life he had chosen. Slowly, he let out a breath. Then he turned to Clara. "Come with me." She asked no questions. Within the hour, they packed only what they truly needed and set off on horseback. They rode deeper into the mountains than Clara had ever traveled before. The narrow trail disappeared beneath towering pines. Branches arched overhead, hiding the morning light until the forest seemed almost untouched by time. After nearly an hour, Ethan guided his horse toward an old stone gate, half hidden beneath climbing ivy. Beyond it stretched a winding road lined with ancient oak trees. Clara's eyes widened. At the end of the road, a manor slowly emerged from the mist, built from pale gray stone. It stood quietly among the mountains. It wasn't covered in gold or decorated with unnecessary luxury. Its beauty came from its timeless elegance. Wide porches, tall windows glowing softly in the morning light. Gardens that had clearly been cared for with patience over many years. Clara stared without saying a word. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Then she slowly turned toward Ethan. "You live here?" He simply nodded. For the first time since they had met, Clara realized there was an entire part of her husband she had never known. Clara slowly stepped through the front door, her footsteps echoing softly across the polished wooden floor. The manor felt lived in. Books lined the shelves. Fresh flowers rested in crystal vases. A fire had already been lit in the great stone fireplace, as though someone had been expecting them. She turned slowly, taking in every corner before looking at Ethan. "Where is this?" He followed her gaze around the quiet hall. Then, with the same calm voice he always used, "My parents' home." Nothing more. He didn't say it belonged to him. He didn't mention the land surrounding it. He didn't explain who had cared for the estate all these years. To him, it was simply his parents' home. As Clara continued walking, her eyes stopped on a large oil portrait hanging above the fireplace. A dignified man stood beside an elegant woman, both wearing gentle smiles. The man's face looked unmistakably familiar. She looked back at Ethan, then at the portrait once more. Without realizing it, her fingers lightly brushed the edge of the frame. The moment she'd see it, another memory quietly surfaced. Golden afternoon sunlight stretched across the front porch of the manor. A young boy stood beside his father, staring out over the valley below. His father's hand rested firmly on his shoulder. "This house," the older man said softly, "was built long before either of us was born. It has protected our family through every season." He looked down at the boy. "Promise me one thing, Ethan." The boy nodded without hesitation. His father smiled. No matter what happens, never sell this house. The young boy looked up into his father's theses. I promise. The memory faded, only the portrait remained, watching silently from the wall. Life changed after they moved into the manor. The rooms were larger, the ceilings higher. The windows welcomed more sunlight than the little cabin ever could. Yet somehow, the distance between Clara and Ethan grew smaller. Each morning, they watered the gardens together, moving quietly between rows of roses and lavender. In the afternoons, Clara often sat by the library window with a book while Ethan read across from her. Sometimes neither of them turned a page for several minutes, simply enjoying the peaceful silence. The stable became another place they shared. She brushed the horses while Ethan repaired saddles or filled the hay racks. Every now and then, their eyes met, followed by quiet smiles that needed no words. Even dinner became a routine they looked forward to. One cooked, the other set the table. They spoke little, but the silence between them no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt comfortable, like two hearts, slowly learning the same rhythm. One afternoon, while cleaning one of the upstairs bedrooms, Clara noticed a small wooden box tucked inside an old cabinet. It was plain, worn smooth by time. Curiosity led her to lift the lid. Inside lay a neatly folded handkerchief, a pressed wildflower, a faded ribbon used to tie long hair, and beneath them, a folded piece of paper. She had only just reached for it when footsteps sounded behind her. Ethan stopped in the doorway. For the first time since they had met, his calm expression disappeared. He crossed the room at once and gently closed the lid. Don't open it. His voice wasn't angry. It was quiet, almost anxious. Clara looked at him, surprised. She slowly withdrew her hand. I'm sorry. Ethan rested his hand on the box for a brief moment before carrying it away without another word. Left alone in the room, Clara couldn't help wondering who had those keepsakes belonged to, and why had Ethan protected them so carefully. They must have belonged to the woman he had once loved. It didn't take long for word to spread. People throughout the town began whispering about the hidden manor deep in the mountains. Some claimed an old noble family had returned. Others insisted a mysterious gentleman had finally opened the estate after years of silence. Soon, the rumors reached the Harper household. Elizabeth laughed the first time she heard them. Clara, living in a manor. Impossible. But curiosity slowly overcame her disbelief. The next morning, she rode into the mountains alone. After following the directions she'd overheard in town, she reached the old stone gate. She froze. Beyond the long tree-lined road stood the manor. Elegant, quiet, far more beautiful than anything she had imagined. Elizabeth stared in disbelief. This can't be. Then she saw them, in the garden below. Clara and Ethan were tending the flowers together. They looked peaceful, comfortable, as though they had belonged there all along. Elizabeth's eyes slowly narrowed. The shock faded. Something else took its place, envy. And then, greed. A few days later, the town square filled with restless voices as the news of the hidden manor had spread farther than anyone expected. People no longer whispered. They argued openly. He pretended to be poor. He tricked everyone. He deceived the Harper family just to marry her. Others nodded in agreement, eager to judge a man they barely knew. Clara stood quietly near the back of the gathering. She listened without speaking. Every accusation landed like another stone against Ethan's name. She remembered the little cabin, the freezing winter mornings, his rough hands split from chopping wood, the nights he stayed awake repairing broken tools instead of resting. None of it had felt like deception. None of it had felt false before she realized he existed. She had taken a step forward. The voices around her slowly faded. If Ethan had wanted to deceive me, she paused, meeting the eyes of those around her. He never would have needed to marry me. Silence settled over the square. He could have hidden who he was forever. He could have lived comfortably without carrying my family's burdens. But he didn't. He never asked me for anything. He never treated me with anything but kindness. No one answered. They had expected shame. Instead, they found quiet certainty. Standing a short distance away, Ethan had heard every word. Hadi had faced suspicion all his life. People had respected his wealth. Some had feared his name. But no one had ever stood in front of others simply to protect him. For a long moment, he could only look at Clara. She turned toward him. Their eyes met across the crowd. A gentle smile appeared on her face. It was small, almost shy, yet as Ethan smiled back, Clara felt an unexpected ache deep inside her heart. The memory of the wooden box returned without warning. The pressed flower, the faded ribbon, the folded note she had never been allowed to read. Somewhere, there had once been another woman, someone he had treasured enough to keep those memories. The thought lingered only for a moment. Clara quietly lowered her eyes. Even so, if the whole town chose to stand against Ethan, she knew exactly where she would stand. Her words echoed in Ethan's mind. If Ethan had wanted to deceive me, the town square disappeared. Another memory quietly took its place. A cold morning. The stone steps of the town bank stood empty beneath a gray sky. Ethan climbed them alone, carrying a heavy leather satchel inside the bank. No one spoke. He placed the satchel on the counter. Gold coins spilled into careful stacks. The banker counted them in silence. A document was slid across the polished desk. Ethan signed his name without hesitation. The banker stamped the receipt. For the briefest moment, the paper turned toward the light. Across the top, only a few words could be read. Harper debt. The banker carefully folded the receipt. Ethan picked it up. Without looking back, he walked out into the morning. No explanation, only the quiet weight of a debt that had already been paid long before anyone knew. The days after the town meeting passed gently. No arguments, no misunderstandings. Only the quiet rhythm of two people sharing the same home. That afternoon, Ethan was repairing one of the old fences along the western pasture. His sleeves were rolled above his forearms. The sun rested warmly across his shoulders as he worked with patient, practiced hands. From the wide front porch of the manor, Clara watched him. She held a basket of freshly folded linens, yet she had forgotten why she had brought them outside. Her eyes never left him. She watched him pause to straighten a crooked post. She watched him wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. She watched the way he smiled to himself whenever one stubborn board finally slipped into place. Without realizing it, she smiled too. A soft breeze stirred the edge of her dress. For the first time in her life, Clara no longer questioned it. She knew. She loved him. Not because he owned a grand estate. Not because he had saved her family. Not because he had been kind. She loved the man who had quietly carried burdens no one else had seen. The man who always walked one step behind her, making sure she would never fall. The realization should have filled her heart with joy. Instead, it frightened her. Her fingers tightened around the folded cloth. The image of the wooden box returned. The pressed flower, the faded ribbon, the carefully folded note. She lowered her eyes. She must have been beautiful. Someone he could never forget. Someone whose memories he still protected. A faint smile touched Clara's lips. It was gentle, and painfully lonely. His heart belonged to someone long before it ever met mine. I have no right to ask for it. Across the yard, Ethan looked up. He found Clara standing beneath the porch roof, quietly watching him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. His tired face softened. He wondered if she was happy, if life here had finally given her peace. A quiet warmth settled in his chest. Then another thought followed, one he had carried since the day she became his wife. She doesn't love me. She's grateful. Nothing more. He accepted the thought without bitterness. If gratitude was all Clara could offer, he would protect even that. He smiled at her. She smiled back. Neither of them knew. They were looking at the person they loved most in the world, and each believed that love could never be returned. Late that evening, the manor rested in silence. The last lamp had been extinguished. Only the pale moonlight slipped through the tall windows. A shadow moved quietly across the hallway. Elizabeth. She had returned under the excuse of retrieving a few belongings that had once belonged to the Harper family. The servants, believing her story, paid little attention. She wandered through the library, then the study. Her sharp eyes searched every drawer with practiced patience. Nothing, until she noticed a weathered leather folder tucked beneath several account books. She opened it. A single document rested inside. Her smile slowly widened. At the top of the page were the words, "Marriage Agreement." She read every line. Each sentence deepened the satisfaction in her eyes. A marriage, 1 year. Mutual obligations, at the end of 12 months. Either party could walk away. Elizabeth carefully folded the document and slipped it beneath her cloak. She closed the drawer exactly as she had found it. Before leaving, she glanced once toward the stairs. A quiet laugh escaped her lips. "So, you aren't his wife. You're only a promise with an expiration date." She disappeared into the darkness. The agreement remained hidden beneath her cloak. And for the first time, Elizabeth held something she believed could destroy everything Clara had found. Rumors spread through the town, faster than the autumn wind. By sunrise, everyone had heard a different version of the same story. There was never a real marriage. It was only a contract. 1 year, that's all. By afternoon, people no longer lowered their voices when Clara walked past. She entered the general store. Conversations stopped, then quietly began again. "So she's only a hired wife. No wonder he kept his distance. He'll leave when the year is over." Someone laughed. Another shook their head with pity. Clara stood perfectly still. Her hands tightened around the small basket she carried. She did not argue. She simply paid for her flour and walked back outside. Each whispered word followed her all the way home. A borrowed wife, a temporary promise. The words settled heavily inside her heart. Without meaning to, she remembered the keepsakes hidden in Ethan's wooden box. The pressed flower, the faded ribbon, the folded note. A quiet thought surfaced. Perhaps I was never meant to stay. Perhaps his heart had always been waiting for someone else. By the time she reached the manor, the afternoon sun had already begun to fade. Ethan was waiting near the front steps. The moment he saw her face, he knew. Someone had told her. He walked toward her without hesitation. "Clara." She stopped, but did not look at him. "I know about the agreement." Her voice was calm. For a long moment, Ethan searched for the right words. He wanted to tell her that the contract had stopped meaning anything the day she smiled at him in that little cabin. He wanted to tell her that every morning beside her had made the agreement meaningless. He wanted to tell her that he had loved her long before either of them stood before the minister. But he couldn't. Not yet. If he revealed the truth now, he would have to explain the hidden promise. The Harper debt. the keepsakes in the wooden box, and the years he had spent silently protecting her from afar. So all he managed to say was almost painfully, "Saul, I never wanted that paper to define us." Clara finally looked into his eyes. She wanted to believe him, more than anything. But somewhere inside her, another voice whispered, if the agreement had never existed, would he still have chosen me? Neither of them spoke again. Only the evening wind moved quietly between them, carrying words that both hearts longed to say, yet neither could. That night, sleep refused to come. Ethan sat alone in his father's old study. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. His eyes drifted toward the portrait above the mantel. Without warning, another memory returned. Years ago, the same room. His father stood beside the window, looking older than Ethan had ever seen him. Illness had already stolen much of his strength. In his hands rested a sealed envelope. The wax seal bore the Gray family crest. His father held it out. Ethan accepted it, without a word. The old man rested a hand on his son's shoulder. His voice was quiet, steady. "You must promise me one thing." Ethan nodded. His father looked directly into his eyes. "Don't open this until after I'm gone." Ethan's fingers tightened around the envelope. "I promise." His father smiled, not with relief, but with peace. The memory faded before the seal was ever broken. The contents of the letter remained unseen. Only the promise endured. Far from the quiet hills surrounding Hidden Manor, a carriage rolled through the gates of a sprawling estate. Its owner stepped down with measured confidence. Victor Ashford, a man whose fortune had been built not by honor, but by acquiring the land of desperate families. He removed his gloves as one of his men hurried toward him. "I've confirmed it, sir." Victor did not look up. "Confirmed what?" "The person living in Hidden Manor." The servant hesitated. "Is Ethan Gray." Victor stopped walking. For several seconds, the courtyard fell silent. "The gray heir," he murmured. "So the boy finally came home." His expression hardened. Years ago, Victor had tried more than once to purchase Hidden Manor. Each offer had been rejected by Ethan's father. Even after the old man died, the estate had never changed hands. Victor had waited patiently, certain that one day the property would become vulnerable. Now, he understood why it never had. A faint smile appeared on his lips. So, the son kept his father's promise. He turned toward another servant. "I don't want the house." His voice was calm. "I want what proves it belongs to him. The ownership papers, the original deeds, the Gray archives." He walked toward the window overlooking his estate. "If I hold the documents, I control the manor." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Far away, Ethan and Clara knew nothing of the man who had just spoken their names, nor did they realize that the greatest danger they had faced so far had never been gossip, misunderstandings, or old contracts. It was a patient enemy who had been waiting for the Gray family to make a single mistake. The next morning, Ethan left the manor before sunrise. He told Clara only that he had business in town. She nodded with a gentle smile. She wanted to ask him to stay for breakfast. Instead, she simply watched him ride away. Perhaps he needed time alone. The thought stung more than she cared to admit. The sheriff's office stood at the edge of town. Its weathered wooden walls had witnessed decades of disputes, thefts, and hard winters. Sheriff William Carter closed the door after Ethan entered. Neither man wasted words. Ethan unrolled a large map across the sheriff's desk. His finger traced several roads leading through the surrounding hills. Then it stopped. One location, a narrow valley marked only by a faded ink circle. The sheriff frowned. You think he'll come through here? Ethan gave a single nod. If I'm right, if I haven't returned by dawn, start the plan. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Are you sure about this? Ethan nodded. Don't follow me. You just need to be there at the right time. Nothing more was said. The sheriff quietly folded the map again. We'll be ready. Ethan left as silently as he had arrived. On the edge of the map, the place Ethan had indicated remained just out of view, its name hidden beneath the fold. No one yet knew what he was preparing for, not even Clara. 2 days later, Elizabeth arrived at the manor. She looked different. The sharpness in her expression had softened. Her voice carried a warmth Clara had almost forgotten. I came to apologize. Clara stared at her in surprise. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. I've been jealous. I let my pride make me cruel. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only hoped that we could have dinner together. Just once. No arguments. Like sisters. Clara hesitated. She remembered the years before resentment had divided them. The afternoons they had laughed together as children. Perhaps people could change. She agreed. That evening, Clara arrived at the old Harper house. The dining room had already been prepared. Candles burned softly. The table was set for two. Elizabeth welcomed her with an affectionate smile. For the first half hour, everything felt strangely peaceful. They spoke about their father, about childhood, about the difficult years after the family's ruin. Clara slowly relaxed. Maybe this was the beginning of something better. Elizabeth poured another cup of tea. You look tired. You should rest for a moment. Clara lifted the cup. The tea tasted faintly sweet, warmer than she expected. A few minutes later, the room began to blur. She blinked. The candlelight stretched into soft streaks. Elizabeth. Her voice barely escaped her lips. I don't. The teacup slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the floor. Clara tried to stand. Her knees gave way. Elizabeth caught her before she hit the ground. The kindness vanished from her face. She looked toward the front door. It's done. The door slowly opened. Heavy footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. Victor Ashford entered without hurry. He looked down at the unconscious young woman, then toward Elizabeth. You've done well. Elizabeth forced a smile. I kept my promise. Victor's eyes rested on Clara for only a moment. Good. Now, let's see how much Ethan Gray is willing to lose to get her back. Outside, the wind swept through the empty yard. Miles away, Ethan urged his horse into a gallop. He did not yet know why. Only that, for the first time in many years, his heart was filled with a sudden, unshakable sense that Clara was in danger. The morning was unnaturally quiet. A single rider approached the manor. He carried no saddlebag, only an envelope sealed with black wax. One of the servants accepted it and hurried inside. Ethan broke the seal. There was no greeting, no signature, only a few lines. Bring the Gray family deeds. Come alone. If you bring anyone else, Clara dies. Folded inside the letter was something else, a small piece of Clara's blue shawl. Ethan recognized it instantly. His hand tightened. For only a heartbeat. Then his expression became calm again. He walked upstairs, past the library, past his father's study, to the hidden iron safe, concealed behind the old bookshelf. The heavy door opened with a dull click. Inside rested dozens of family documents, land grants, letters, property records. At the very bottom, a worn leather case. Ethan lifted it carefully. He paused before closing the safe. His eyes drifted toward the portrait of his parents. I'll bring her home. The words were almost a whisper. He tucked the case beneath his arm, saddled his horse, and rode away, alone. No servants, no deputies, No escort, only the steady sound of hoofbeats fading into the distant hills. An abandoned lumber mill stood deep inside the valley. Broken windows rattled in the wind. Victor Ashford waited in the center of the empty building. Elizabeth stood several steps behind him. Clara sat bound to a wooden chair. Her wrists were tied. A cloth restrained her mouth. When she saw Ethan walk through the doorway, her eyes filled with panic. He had come alone, exactly as the letter demanded. Victor smiled. "I knew you would." His gaze settled on the leather case beneath Ethan's arm. Ethan stepped forward. Victor stretched out one hand. "Give them to me." No hesitation, no bargaining, no threats. Ethan placed the leather case into Victor's waiting hand, without asking Clara if she was unharmed, without demanding proof, without trying to negotiate. The exchange lasted only seconds. Elizabeth stared in disbelief. Even Victor looked briefly surprised. So easily, Ethan's voice remained steady. "They're only paper." He looked directly at Clara. "My wife isn't." Clara's eyes trembled. She had believed the manor meant everything to him. His family's legacy, his inheritance, the home his father had protected his entire life. Yet he had surrendered it, without a second thought. For her. Victor slowly opened the leather case. He smiled as he looked through the documents. Excellent. He tucked them beneath his coat. Ethan took one careful step forward. "The papers are yours. Release Clara." Victor remained silent. Then, he laughed. Several armed men emerged from the shadows. At that same moment, another man rushed inside. "The manor is ready." Victor nodded once. "Do it." Miles away, the quiet hills surrounding Hidden Manor lay beneath the evening sky. A torch struck the dry stable roof. Another crashed through a library window. Then another. Within seconds, orange flames climbed the weathered timber walls. Smoke rolled upward, like a gathering storm. The old house that had sheltered generations of the Gray family began to burn. Back at the mill, Victor watched Ethan's face. His voice was low, but cold. "I never wanted the mansion. I never cared about those papers, either. What I wanted was for the Gray family to disappear." He looked at Ethan. "You, that woman, and Hidden Mansion. By the end of today, all of you will be gone." For the first time since arriving, pain flickered across Ethan's eyes. Not because of the estate, not because of the fortune. Inside those burning walls rested every memory of his parents, every letter, every photograph, every trace of the family that had raised him. Victor smiled, believing he had finally broken Ethan. But Ethan never looked toward the burning horizon. His eyes never left Clara. As long as she was still alive, nothing else mattered. Victor watched him carefully. Then he smiled. "So that's your choice." He slowly raised his hand. "Kill him." The nearest gunman lifted his rifle before his finger could squeeze the trigger. Bang! The shot echoed through the abandoned sawmill. The outlaw's rifle flew from his hands. Everyone froze. Another shot shattered a lantern hanging from the rafters. Darkness and sparks rained across the room. Then a commanding voice thundered from outside. "Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons." Deputies burst through every entrance of the old mill. Some stormed through the front doors. Others appeared along the upper catwalks. Several more emerged from behind towering stacks of lumber. Within seconds, the entire sawmill was surrounded. Victor's confident smile disappeared. "You?" His eyes widened. "You planned this?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes swept across the room in a single heartbeat. Every gunman, every doorway, every blind corner, every path leading to Clara. He spoke without raising his voice. Two men behind the saw blades, one above the catwalk. Don't fire toward Clara. Sheriff glanced toward Ethan. For a brief second, he understood. This man wasn't simply wealthy. He saw everything before anyone else did. He didn't hesitate. You heard him. Deputies immediately shifted their positions. Gunfire erupted. The abandoned mill exploded into chaos. Victor's men fired wildly. The deputies answered with disciplined shots. Splinters burst from old beams. Broken glass scattered across the floor. Smoke drifted through the air. Amid the confusion, Ethan lunged toward a fallen revolver. He caught it before anyone else could. A gunman swung his rifle toward Clara. Bang! The rifle spun from the man's hands. Another outlaw rushed from behind a stack of timber. Bang! A heavy chain snapped. Bundles of cut lumber crashed onto the floor between Clara and the remaining gunman. The path to her was suddenly clear. Ethan ran, ignoring the bullets cutting through the air around him, ignoring everything except her. He dropped beside Clara. It's all right. I'm here. With one quick motion, he cut through the ropes binding her wrists. Clara looked at him with tear-filled eyes. I knew you'd come. Ethan helped her to her feet. Behind them, the fight was already ending. One by one, Victor's men threw down their weapons. Deputies rushed forward, forcing them to the ground. Victor reached inside his coat. A hidden pistol flashed into his hand. He aimed straight at Ethan. Before he could fire, bang! Ethan's shot struck the pistol. The weapon flew across the floor. Victor staggered backward. Two deputies tackled him before he could recover. Cold iron handcuffs snapped around his wrists. At the rear entrance, Elizabeth tried to slip into the shadows. She had barely taken 3 steps. Don't move. A deputy stepped from behind a wagon, revolver already drawn. Elizabeth froze. Moments later, handcuffs closed around her wrists as well. Sheriff walked toward Victor. His voice was calm. It's over. For the first time, neither Victor nor Elizabeth had anywhere left to run. The pounding of hooves echoed through the valley. A deputy rode into the yard at full speed. His horse was lathered with sweat. He barely stopped before shouting, Sheriff, Hidden Mansion is on fire. Every face turned toward the distant hills. Far beyond the trees, a towering column of black smoke climbed into the evening sky. Ethan stared at it. For the first time that day, the calm disappeared from his eyes. Without another word, he ran for his horse. Clara was only a step behind him. The sheriff shouted orders as deputies scattered across the yard. Half of you stay here. The rest with me. Within seconds, horses thundered out of the abandoned mill. The narrow trail echoed beneath pounding hooves. No one spoke. Only the relentless rhythm of galloping horses filled the fading evening. Long before they reached the estate, they could already smell the smoke. Hidden Manor stood against the darkening sky. Its stone walls still rose proudly, but flames had consumed the stable. The western wing burned fiercely. Fire poured from broken library windows. Burning pieces of the roof crashed into the courtyard below. Servants and nearby ranchers formed desperate lines, passing buckets from the well. It wasn't enough. The fire kept spreading. Ethan leaped from his horse before it had fully stopped. My parents' library. He sprinted toward the burning entrance. Clara reached for him. Ethan, I was already gone. The sheriff began directing the deputies. Form 2 lines. Protect the main hall. Keep the fire away from the east wing. Deputies and townspeople rushed into action. Water splashed against blazing timber. Axes hacked through burning beams. Smoke swallowed the front entrance. Inside, heat wrapped around Ethan like a living thing. Flames crawled across shelves lined with old books. Portraits crashed from the walls. A burning beam struck the floor behind him. Still, he pressed forward. He found an old wooden chest beneath his father's desk. With both hands, he dragged it free. Just as he turned, a deafening crack echoed overhead. The massive roof beam broke loose. "Ethan!" Clara's scream pierced the smoke. She had followed him inside. The falling timber came crashing toward her. Without thinking, Ethan threw himself against her. The beam slammed into his back. The force hurled Clara across the floor. "Ethan!" She crawled toward him. He struggled to rise. "No. Go." Another section of the ceiling groaned above them. "You have to leave." Clara shook her head, tears streaming through the soot on her face. "No." She grabbed his hand. Her fingers tightened around his. "This time, I won't leave you behind." For one brief moment, the roaring fire seemed to disappear. There was only her hand, holding his. Together, they struggled to their feet. Step by painful step, they moved toward the shattered doorway. Behind them, the ceiling collapsed. A wave of fire chased them through the hall. They stumbled into the courtyard just as the entrance caved in with a thunderous crash. Clara collapsed beside Ethan. He tried to stand. His legs gave way. Blood slowly soaked through the back of his shirt, where the beam had struck him. Sheriff hurried to his side. "Ethan." Several deputies rushed forward. They carefully lifted him away from the burning entrance. By now, the flames had finally begun to weaken. The stone walls of Hidden Manor still stood. The eastern wing had been saved. Most of the great house remained untouched, but the stable, the western wing, and much of the old library had been lost to the fire. Hidden Manor had survived, scarred, broken, but still standing. And as Ethan's eyes slowly closed from pain, the last thing he saw was Clara refusing to let go of his hand. The deputies carried Ethan away from the collapsing entrance. Blood stained his shirt. Every breath grew weaker than the last. The sheriff shouted for the doctor. No one knew if he could survive. Clara knelt beside him, refusing to let go of his hand. "Ethan, stay with me." His trembling fingers slowly closed around hers. He looked into her tear-filled eyes. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "There was never anyone else, except you." Clara froze. Ethan struggled for another breath. "I never loved anyone else. The one I always waited for was you." Tears streamed down Clara's face. She shook her head again and again. "No, no. Ethan, you can't leave me now." He tried to lift his hand to her cheek. It barely moved. His fingers brushed against her skin. Then, his eyes slowly closed. His hand slipped from hers. "Ethan." Her cry echoed across the smoke-filled courtyard. The deputies rushed forward. Together, they lifted Ethan from the ground. His head fell weakly against one deputy's shoulder. His eyes remained closed. Blood still stained the back of his shirt. "Move. Get him inside." The sheriff threw open the manor doors. "Doctor, the doctor, now." Within moments, the old physician hurried across the great hall with his medical bag. He dropped to his knees beside Ethan. The room fell silent. Clara stood frozen. Her hands were still trembling. The doctor pressed his fingers against Ethan's neck. One heartbeat, then another. He quickly examined the wound before wrapping it tightly with clean bandages. Finally, he let out a long breath. "He's still alive." Clara covered her mouth. Fresh tears spilled down her face. The doctor looked up at everyone gathered around. "The bleeding has stopped, but he must rest. No one can wake him. He has survived. For now." The words seemed to lift the unbearable weight from the room. Clara slowly knelt beside Ethan's bed. She gently took his hand into both of hers. It was cold, but it was warm enough to tell her he was still with her. She lowered her forehead against his fingers. Her eyes closed. For the first time that night, Clara allowed herself to breathe. Morning sunlight filtered through the smoke-blackened windows of Hidden Manor. The fire was gone. Only silence remained. Inside the burned library, 2 deputies carefully carried out a small wooden chest. Its corners were scorched. Its brass lock was blackened by fire. The sheriff looked at it quietly. So, this was what he went back for. Clara froze. She recognized it immediately. It was the same chest Ethan had always kept hidden. The same one he had once stopped her from opening. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward it. Then she stopped. I shouldn't. The old doctor gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He risked his life to save it. Perhaps. He wanted you to know. Clara slowly nodded. She lifted the lid. Inside, everything remained exactly where Ethan had left it. The faded handkerchief, the pressed wildflower, the blue ribbon. She had seen them once before. Back then, she had believed they belonged to another woman. Her fingers reached for the ribbon. As she turned it over, something caught the light. In one tiny corner, almost hidden by years of wear, 2 delicate letters had been stitched by hand. C.H. Clara froze. Her breath stopped. C.H. Clara Harper. The ribbon slipped through her trembling fingers. A forgotten memory rushed back. A little girl laughed as she ran through a field of wildflowers. The wind tugged at her hair. The blue ribbon came loose. She chased after it. But another gust carried it away. I can't find it. Little Clara searched the grass until sunset. She finally gave up, believing the wind had stolen it forever. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek. It wasn't the wind, she whispered. It was you. Her shaking hands reached beneath the keepsakes. There, folded neatly at the bottom of the chest, lay the one paper Ethan had never allowed her to read. She unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded with age at the top. Only a date, spring, 1880. Beneath it, a few simple lines. The little girl by the creek smiled again today. She dropped her ribbon. I hope she will always smile like that. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Another line waited below. One day, if fate is kind, I'll tell her everything. Her breathing caught. This was never a family secret. This was never something Ethan wanted to hide from the world. He had only been hiding his own heart. Her fingers shook as she reached deeper into the chest. There was another folded page. The paper looked newer. The handwriting was the same. She slowly opened it. Clara, you'll never read this, so perhaps it's easier to tell the truth. Her vision blurred. She continued reading through silent tears. The handkerchief was yours. The flower was yours. The ribbon was yours. Every happy memory I kept was because of you. She pressed one trembling hand against her lips. The final lines nearly stole the breath from her chest. If one day you marry another man, I'll still be grateful that I was lucky enough to meet you. The room disappeared around her. The handkerchief, the flower, the ribbon. They had never belonged to another woman. They had always belonged to her. And Ethan had never been collecting keepsakes. I had been protecting every precious piece of the childhood he had shared with the only girl he had ever loved. 3 days later, the morning sun spilled gently through the bedroom window. Hidden Manor was quiet once more. Only the soft crackling of the fireplace broke the silence. Clara had barely slept. She had refused to leave Ethan's bedside. Her fingers still rested around his hand. Suddenly, she felt it. A faint movement. His fingers moved ever so slightly beneath hers. Clara lifted her head. Ethan. His eyelashes fluttered. Then, for the first time since the fire, his eyes opened. For a brief moment, he seemed confused, until his gaze found Clara. Tears instantly filled her eyes. A trembling smile spread across her face. "You're awake." She laughed through her tears. I thought I was going to lose you." Without thinking, she leaned forward and gently wrapped her arms around him. Ethan winced from the pain. Yet, he smiled. Very slowly, he lifted one weak hand and brushed away the tears from her cheek. "I'm sorry. I made you cry again." Clara shook her head. "You promised. You'd never leave me. And you kept your promise." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words no longer seemed necessary. Then Ethan looked toward the small drawer beside his bed. There lay a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age across the front, written in firm, familiar handwriting. "To my son." Ethan nodded softly. "You can read it now." Clara gently broke the old seal. She unfolded the letter. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My son, I owe the Harper family a debt. But do not marry Jonathan Harper's daughter because of my promise. Marry the woman who makes you happy." The room fell silent. Clara slowly lowered the letter. She looked at Ethan. "So, you were never bound by that promise?" Ethan smiled faintly. "No, I never was." His eyes never left hers. "I never wanted to marry your sister." There was no hesitation in his voice. "The only woman I ever wanted was you." Fresh tears rolled down Clara's cheeks. Every misunderstanding, every fear, every painful doubt vanished with those simple words. Ethan reached for her hand. "The day your stepmother called you out, I already knew. I knew the bride standing before me was the girl I'd been waiting for." His thumb gently brushed across her fingers. "I will never let you go again." Clara could no longer hold back her tears. She carefully leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight spread across Hidden Manor. For the first time, there were no more secrets between them. Only two hearts that had finally found their way home. Several days later, Ethan had recovered enough to walk without help. He opened the desk drawer and took out two folded papers, the marriage agreement, and beneath it, a signed divorce document. He placed them gently into Clara's hands. His smile was as gentle as ever. "When we married, you carried everyone else's choices. Your father's, your stepmother's, my family's promise." He looked quietly into her eyes. "For once, I want your life to belong only to you. If you stay, I want it to be because your heart chose me. And if it doesn't, I'll still be grateful that I was allowed to love you." Silence filled the room. Clara lowered her head. She looked at the signature on the divorce papers. Then she slowly tore the page in half. Again and again. The pieces slipped from her fingers like falling snow. Tears blurred her vision. "You've spent all this time giving me the freedom to leave." She stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "But you've never realized. My heart stopped looking for another place the day it found you." Ethan stood speechless. Clara gently held his face in both hands. "I've read your letters. I've seen every piece of the life you quietly built around me. You loved me when I didn't even know how to love you back." Her voice trembled. "So let me choose now." She smiled through her tears. "I wasn't kept here by a promise. I wasn't kept here by gratitude. I'm here because nowhere in this world feels more like home than being beside you." Ethan closed his eyes. A tear escaped despite himself. Clara rested her forehead against his. "You waited for me long enough. It's my turn to spend the rest of my life loving you." The following spring, Hidden Manor stood whole again. 1 year earlier, they had stood before a minister with nothing but a marriage certificate. No wedding dress, no wedding vows, no family offering their blessing, only silence and a promise neither of them had chosen. This time, everything was different. The garden behind Hidden Manor was filled with fresh white flowers. Neighbors from town arrived carrying homemade pies and wildflowers. The old sheriff came smiling with his wife. Families Ethan had quietly helped through the years gathered beneath the blooming trees. The old doctor stood near the front, his eyes already glistening. No one had been invited because of wealth. They came because they loved them. For the first time, Clara wore the wedding dress she had never had. Simple, elegant, beautiful. Ethan waited beneath the old oak tree, dressed in the finest suit he had ever owned. When Clara walked toward him, his eyes never left her. She smiled, the same smile he had wished would never disappear, ever since the little girl beside the creek. The minister looked at them with gentle eyes. A warm smile crossed his face. Last time, you were married because of a signature. Ethan reached for Clara's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally. The minister continued, but today, you stand here because you chose each other. Ethan turned toward Clara. His voice was quiet. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to ask you one more time. He smiled. Not the smile of a man carrying an old promise, but the smile of a man whose heart had finally come home. Clara Harper, will you spend the rest of your life with me? Clara laughed through happy tears. You've been my husband for a year. She gently squeezed his hand. But today, I finally get to become your wife. I will. The minister closed his Bible. Then before God, and before everyone who loves you, I ask you to remember this day, not as the day you became husband and wife, but as the day you freely chose to remain so. Applause filled the spring air as Ethan kissed Clara beneath the blooming trees. The wind carried flower petals across the garden, like the little white blossom. A quiet boy had once pressed between the pages of a book, while hoping that one day, the little girl beside the creek would smile at him again.